Hey everyone, settle in and get comfortable. Tonight we're heading to the mountains of Montana to talk about a case that's both heartbreaking and absolutely chilling. This is the story of Dustin Gersom, a 35-year-old dad and outdoorsman who loved camping in the beautiful wilderness near Big Sky, Montana. What happened to Dustin on October night in 2024 was something no one could have predicted. It was a random encounter in the woods that turned deadly, and for a brief moment, everyone thought it might have been a bear attack. But the truth turned out to be far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. So as you listen to the rain falling in the background, let me tell you about Dustin's story. About a man who was kind enough to welcome a stranger to his campsite and offer him a beer. And about how that simple act of generosity cost him everything. Let's start at the beginning, because before we talk about what happened, I want you to know who Dustin really was. Because he wasn't just a victim in a crime story, he was a real person with a full life, people who loved him, and so much he still wanted to do. Dustin Gersom was 35 years old in October 2024. He lived in Belgrade, Montana, which is a small town of about 10,000 people in the southwestern part of the state. Belgrade sits in the Galapin Valley, surrounded by mountain ranges, and it's the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors and the outdoors are a way of life. Dustin was a father of 2 children. His sister would later describe him as someone who was always working, always learning, always trying to improve himself and provide for his family. He worked as a self-employed contractor, building homes and learning various trades. The kind of guy who could fix anything, build anything, figure out any problem you threw at him. If you've ever known someone like that, someone who just seems capable and reliable and solid, that was Dustin. The type of person you'd want on your team when things got tough. The type of dad his kids could count on. But beyond his work ethic and his skills, Dustin loved the Montana outdoors. And I mean really loved it. He was an experienced outdoorsman who knew how to camp, how to survive in the wilderness, how to be comfortable in places that might make other people nervous. The mountains weren't just a place he visited occasionally, they were part of who he was. And that brings us to Big Sky, Montana. If you've never been to Big Sky, Montana, let me paint you a picture. It's a resort town tucked into the Rocky Mountains in Madison County, about 45 miles south of Bozeman. The area is absolutely stunning, we're talking massive peaks, dense forests, crystal clear streams, and wildlife everywhere you look. Big Sky is famous for its ski resort, which is one of the largest ski areas in the United States. In the winter, people flock there from all over to ski and snowboard. But in the warmer months, from late spring through fall, the area transforms into a paradise for hikers, fishers, campers, and anyone who wants to get away from civilization for a while. The wilderness around Big Sky is the kind of place where you can drive for miles on rough forest roads, set up a campsite, and not see another person for days if you don't want to. It's isolated, peaceful, and beautiful. For someone like Dustin who loved camping, it was the perfect escape. Now, with that kind of isolation comes a certain amount of risk. We're talking about genuine wilderness here, grizzly bears, black bears, mountain lions, elk, moose, all kinds of wildlife that can be dangerous if you're not careful. Cell phone service is spotty at best in many areas. If something goes wrong out there, you might be a long way from help. But for experienced campers like Dustin, those risks were just part of the adventure. You take precautions, you stay aware of your surroundings, and you enjoy being out in nature, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. In October 2024, Dustin decided to take a camping trip to the Moose Creek area near Big Sky. It was something he'd done many times before. He knew the area, he knew what he was doing, and he was looking forward to a relaxing weekend in the mountains. He had no idea it would be his last camping trip. The plan for that weekend in October was pretty straightforward. Dustin was going to head up to a campsite near Moose Creek on Thursday, October 10th. He'd set up camp, get everything ready, and then on Friday night, October 11th, he'd drive back down to pick up his girlfriend from work. They'd spend the weekend together at the campsite, enjoying the fall weather and the peace of the mountains. It was the kind of plan that sounds absolutely perfect, right? Get out of town for a few days, spend time with someone you care about, disconnect from work and phones and all the daily stress. Just the two of you and the wilderness. So on Thursday morning, October 10th, 2024, Dustin loaded up his truck with all his camping gear. And when I say camping gear, I'm not talking about throwing a sleeping bag in the back of a car. Dustin was a serious camper. He had a wall tent, that's a big canvas tent with a frame that creates an actual room-sized space. He brought beds, a stove for heat and cooking, coolers full of food and drinks, and all the other equipment you need for comfortable camping in the mountains in October. October in Montana can be cold, especially at higher elevations. Temperatures can drop below freezing at night. But with the right equipment and know-how, you can stay warm and comfortable. Dustin knew what he was doing. He drove up to the Moose Creek area, which is accessed by forest roads off Highway 191. These aren't paved roads, we're talking dirt and gravel, rough in places, the kind of roads where you need to watch for rocks and ruts. The kind of roads that take you deep into national forest land, far from towns and traffic. When Dustin found the spot he wanted, he started setting up camp. It probably took him a few hours to get everything just right, getting the wall tent up and properly staked down, arranging the beds inside, setting up the stove, organizing all his gear. He was creating a comfortable little home away from home, right there in the forest. And here's something important to know about Dustin's campsite, it was nice. Like, really nice for a backcountry setup. The wall tent was substantial, the beds were actual cots with mattresses, there was a functioning stove. This wasn't roughing it, this was camping in comfort. The kind of setup that takes time, effort, and money to put together. By the time Dustin finished setting up, it was probably late afternoon or evening. The sun sets early in Montana in October, and the temperature starts dropping fast once it goes down. Dustin made himself comfortable, probably made some dinner, and settled in for the night. He had his phone with him, though service out there was unpredictable at best. He had a cooler full of beer and food. He had his firearms, a .44 Magnum pistol in a holster and a shotgun, which is pretty standard for camping in bear country. You want something with you that can stop a large animal if you absolutely have to. Everything was going according to plan. Dustin was probably looking forward to Friday, when he'd pick up his girlfriend and they'd spend the weekend together in this peaceful spot. The weather was cool but not too cold yet. The fall colors in the mountains would have been beautiful, aspens turning gold, the air crisp and clean. It should have been perfect. But sometime that evening, on Thursday, October 10, 2024, someone else showed up at Dustin's campsite. A stranger. Someone Dustin had never met before and would never have any reason to expect to see out there. And that's when everything went wrong. So now we need to talk about Darren Christopher Abbey. Because he's the person who showed up at Dustin's campsite that Thursday evening. And understanding who Abbey was and what was going on in his life helps us understand how this tragedy happened. Darren Christopher Abbey was 41 years old in October 2024. He had been living in Basant, Montana, which is a tiny community, and when I say tiny, I mean about 200 people, in the mountains northeast of Butte. But Abbey didn't have a stable living situation. He'd been moving around, staying in different places, and he'd been employed in the Big Sky area at various times. Abbey had a troubled past. He had a criminal record, including convictions that had landed him in prison. In fact, in 2020, he'd been convicted on a repeat DUI charge, meaning he'd been arrested multiple times for driving under the influence. He served prison time for that, and by October 2024, he was on conditional release, which meant he was out of prison but still under supervision and had to follow certain rules. If he violated the terms of his release, if he got arrested again, if he failed drug tests, if he didn't check in with his probation officer, he could be sent back to prison. That's important to remember for later. Abbey also had some concerning associations. According to inmate information documents, he had listed an organizational affiliation with white supremacist groups. Now, I want to be careful here because we don't know exactly how deep those connections went or what they meant in practical terms. But it's part of his background that came out during the investigation. What we do know is that Abby had been having trouble in his life. He was living an unsettled existence, moving around, dealing with the restrictions of being on conditional release. And on October 10, 2024, he decided he wanted to go camping. He drove to the Moose Creek area near Big Sky, looking for a place to set up his tent for the night. This is national forest land, which means it's legal to camp in most places as long as you follow the rules. Abby was probably looking for a decent spot, maybe near a creek for water, somewhere relatively flat, somewhere that looked safe and comfortable. And that's when he saw Dustin's campsite. I want you to imagine this scene for a moment. You're hiking or driving through the woods, looking for a place to camp. It's getting dark, the temperature is dropping, and you're probably getting tired and cold. And then you see it, a campsite that's already set up. Not just a little tent, but a full-walled tent with a stove, beds, the works. Smoke coming from the chimney pipe, meaning it's warm inside. Lights on. Someone clearly already there and settled in. Now, here's where things could have gone a bunch of different ways. Abby could have just kept going and found his own spot. Called out from a distance to ask if the camper minded having a neighbor nearby. Turned around and gone back to find a completely different area. But that's not what happened. According to what Abby would later tell investigators, he approached the campsite. And Dustin Jersom, being the kind of person he was, welcomed him. Dustin didn't know this man. He had no reason to trust him or let him into his space. But Dustin was friendly. He was the kind of guy who figured if someone else was out in the woods, they were probably okay. Fellow campers, fellow outdoors lovers, no reason to be unfriendly. In his confession to detectives, Abby said that Dustin welcomed him to the campsite and offered him a beer. Think about that for a second. Here's Dustin, all alone in the wilderness, and a stranger shows up. And instead of being suspicious or worried, Dustin was hospitable. Come on in, have a beer, warm up by the stove. Maybe they chatted about the weather, about camping, about whatever. Just two people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. This is the kind of thing that happens in camping areas and hiking trails all the time, right? You run into other people, you're friendly, maybe you swap stories about where you've been and where you're headed. Most of the time, these encounters are perfectly fine. Pleasant, even. You meet interesting people, hear good stories, and everybody goes their separate ways. But this time, something was different. Something was wrong with this encounter from the start, even though Dustin probably didn't realize it. We don't know exactly what was going through Abby's mind when he saw that campsite. We don't know what he was thinking when Dustin welcomed him and offered him a beer. The investigation would never fully answer the question of motive. Why did Abby do what he did next? Was he angry that Dustin had taken the campsite he wanted? Was there something about Dustin that set him off? Was it drugs or alcohol affecting his judgment? Was it something in Abby's background, some violence in him that was always looking for an outlet? Was it the association with extremist groups that had warped his thinking? We just don't know. What we do know is what happened next. At some point while Abby was at the campsite, maybe they'd been talking for a while, maybe it was almost immediately, we'll never know, Abby decided to attack Dustin Jersom. According to what Abby told investigators, and according to the physical evidence found at the scene, here's what happened. Abby picked up a piece of solid wood, probably firewood that was at the campsite, and struck Dustin with it. We're not talking about just hitting him once. The autopsy would later show multiple chop wounds, meaning Abby hit him over and over, with tremendous force. But Abby didn't stop there. He grabbed a screwdriver, a tool that Dustin probably had with his camping gear, and stabbed Dustin in the neck with it. And then he grabbed an axe that was at the campsite and hit Dustin with that too. The autopsy report specifically mentioned chopped wounds to Dustin's skull. To his head. The blunt side of an axe crashing into a human skull with enough force to cause fatal injuries. This wasn't a quick attack. This wasn't someone acting in a panic and then immediately stopping. This was sustained, brutal violence. Abby used 3 different weapons, the wooden block, the screwdriver, the axe, and he kept going until Dustin Gershom was dead. During his trial, the prosecutor would tell the jury something chilling. When Abby was interviewed by detectives and described the attack, he talked about aiming for Dustin's head. The prosecutor said, he said in his interview he was aiming for his head. You may find in deliberation that it was spot on. It was accurate and it was hard and it was powerful. Think about that level of violence. Think about what it takes to do that to another human being. To look at someone who just offered you hospitality, who welcomed you when they didn't have to, who was just trying to enjoy a camping trip, and to attack them like that. And Dustin would have fought back. He had to have fought back. This was a strong, capable man who knew how to handle himself. But he was taken by surprise, probably, and once the attack started with that initial blow, he may not have had a chance to defend himself effectively. Within minutes, maybe seconds, Dustin Gershom was dead in his own campsite. The place he'd carefully set up for a peaceful weekend had become a crime scene. And then Abby had to decide what to do next. After Dustin was dead, Abby didn't call for help. He didn't flag down a passing car or hiker. He didn't turn himself in or claim self-defense or accident or anything like that. Instead, he started covering his tracks. According to what Abby later admitted to investigators, he looked around the campsite for anything that could connect him to the crime. Anything he might have touched. Anything that might have his fingerprints or DNA on it. He took the beer can he'd been drinking from, the one Dustin had given him. That's important, because that beer can become a critical piece of evidence later. He took Dustin's cooler, specifically, a Yeti cooler, which is an expensive brand. The cooler probably had food and drinks in it. He took Dustin's firearms, both the .44 Magnum pistol with its holster and the shotgun. These were valuable items, but they were also items Abby had probably touched while he was in the campsite. He took Dustin's cell phones. Dustin had at least one phone, maybe more. He took other belongings that could have his fingerprints on them. And then he took the murder weapons. He took the axe and the screwdriver, and according to his later confession, he washed them in a nearby creek. Trying to get rid of blood evidence, trying to make sure they wouldn't link him to the crime. But Abby wasn't done. After gathering all these items and leaving the campsite, Abby didn't just go home and try to forget what happened. The next day, Friday, October 11th, he came back to the campsite. Why would he come back? According to what he told investigators, he thought he might have left a beanie there. A hat. He was worried that if investigators found it, they might be able to get DNA from it and link him to the crime scene. So he returned to the scene of the murder, stepping back into that campsite where Dustin's body was still lying in the tent. He searched around, looking for the beanie. We don't know if he found it or if it was even really there. But he was there, less than 24 hours after killing a man, making sure he hadn't left any evidence behind. This behavior is important, because it shows Abby knew what he'd done was wrong. He knew he could get in serious trouble for it. He was trying to cover it up, trying to make sure he wouldn't get caught. This wasn't someone in a state of shock or panic. This was calculated behavior. After that second visit, Abby left the area. He had Dustin's firearms, his cooler, his phones, and other items from the campsite. He had a murder weapon he'd washed in a creek. And somewhere in the woods near Big Sky, Montana, Dustin Gershom's body lay in a tent, waiting to be discovered. The temperature continued to drop as Friday night turned into Saturday morning. The campsite that should have been filled with laughter and conversation between Dustin and his girlfriend instead held only silence and tragedy. And Dustin's girlfriend was about to make a terrible discovery. So let's talk about Friday, October 11th, 2024, from Dustin's girlfriend's perspective. She was probably at work during the day, looking forward to getting off and heading up to the mountains. Dustin was supposed to pick her up that evening, and then they'd drive back up to the campsite together for a romantic weekend in the wilderness. But Friday evening came and went, and Dustin never showed up. Now, this kind of thing happens sometimes, right? Maybe his truck broke down. Maybe he lost track of time. Maybe he decided to stay at the campsite longer and would pick her up Saturday morning instead. There could be 100 innocent explanations. But it was also possible that something had gone wrong. Remember, this was remote wilderness. Cell phone service was unreliable at best. If Dustin had gotten injured somehow, hurt himself while setting up camp, had an accident while hiking or gathering firewood, whatever, he might not be able to call for help. His girlfriend would have tried calling and texting. The messages probably wouldn't have gone through, or they'd go through but there'd be no response. She might have figured he was in an area with no service and he'd call when he could. But as Friday night turned into Saturday morning, and there was still no word from Dustin, his girlfriend started to worry more seriously. This wasn't like him. He'd said he'd pick her up Friday night. If the plan had changed, he would have found a way to let her know. She made a decision. She was going to drive up to the campsite and find him. She asked a friend to come with her, smart move, because you never want to go into remote wilderness alone when you're worried about someone. 2 people are safer than 1. They can help each other if something goes wrong. On Saturday, October 12, 2024, Dustin's girlfriend and her friend drove up Highway 191 toward Big Sky, then turned off onto the forest roads that led to the Moose Creek area. These roads probably looked different in the daylight than they had when Dustin drove up them Thursday evening. You could see the mountains rising all around, the dense forest, the occasional clearing. Beautiful country, but also isolated. The kind of place where you realize how far you are from help if something bad happens. They found the campsite. Dustin's truck was there. The wall tent was still standing. From the outside, everything probably looked fine. But Dustin didn't come out of the tent when they arrived. I can't even imagine what was going through their minds as they approached that tent. Calling Dustin's name, maybe. Getting worried when there was no answer. Starting to fear the worst. When they looked inside the tent, they found Dustin's body. The scene was horrific. The injuries to Dustin were severe, the multiple chop wounds, the trauma to his skull, the stab wound to his neck. There was blood. The violence of what had happened would have been immediately obvious. And in that moment, Dustin's girlfriend and her friend had to make sense of what they were seeing. This was someone they knew, someone they cared about, lying dead in a tent in the wilderness. What had happened? How did this happen? The first thought that apparently came to mind, and honestly, it's understandable given the location and the nature of the injuries, was that maybe a bear had attacked Dustin. Bear attacks in Montana are rare, but they do happen. Grizzly bears and black bears both live in the Big Sky area. If a bear came into a campsite looking for food and a person got between the bear and what it wanted, or if the bear felt threatened, it could attack. And bear attacks can be brutal. Powerful claws and teeth can cause terrible injuries. Looking at Dustin's body, with the trauma and the blood and not knowing what else to make of it, his girlfriend and her friend thought they might be looking at the aftermath of a bear attack. So that's what they reported when they called for help. When the call came in to the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office on Saturday, October 12, reporting a possible bear attack at a campsite near Big Sky, it triggered a specific kind of response. First, sheriff's deputies would respond to the scene. But so would Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officials, because investigating animal attacks is part of their job. If a bear had killed someone at a campsite, they'd need to determine if the bear was still in the area, if it posed a continuing threat, whether it needed to be tracked and euthanized for public safety. The responders drove up those forest roads to the remote campsite. This was a Saturday, and the news that there might have been a fatal bear attack near Big Sky would have been spreading quickly through the community. Bear attacks are big news. They're rare enough to be shocking, but common enough in Montana that people take them seriously. When the investigators arrived at the campsite and began examining Dustin's body and the scene, something became clear pretty quickly: this wasn't a bear attack. The wildlife experts looked for signs that would indicate a bear had been there. They looked for tracks in the dirt around the campsite, scat, bear droppings, in the area, claw marks on the tent or trees, scattered food or coolers that had been torn open, hair caught on branches or fabric, the specific pattern of injuries that bear claws and teeth would cause. They found none of that. No bear tracks. No bear scat. No signs that any bear had been anywhere near that campsite recently. And when they looked more closely at Dustin's injuries, they didn't match what a bear attack looks like. The wounds were too specific, too targeted. The chop wounds to the skull, the stab wound to the neck, these weren't random slashes from claws or bites from teeth. These were deliberate, weapon-inflicted injuries. This was a homicide. Someone had murdered Dustin Jersom at his campsite. Someone had used weapons, a piece of wood, a screwdriver, an axe, to kill him. This wasn't an animal attack. This was human violence. The realization changed everything. This wasn't a tragic case of wildlife danger. This was murder. And that meant there was a killer who might still be in the area. Once investigators determined they were dealing with a homicide, the case became much more complex. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office called in additional resources. This became a major crime scene investigation in a remote location, which presented its own challenges. First, they had to secure the scene. That's harder in the wilderness than in a city. There are no walls or doors to close. Anyone could potentially approach from any direction through the trees. They had to establish a perimeter and make sure no one contaminated the scene or destroyed evidence. They had to document everything. Photographs of the body, the tent, the campsite layout, every item present, every detail. They had to measure distances, create diagrams, make sure they had a complete record of what the scene looked like when they found it. They had to search for evidence. In a campsite, that's complicated. There's gear everywhere: camping equipment, cooking supplies, firewood, personal items. What's supposed to be there and what might be evidence? What's missing that should be there? They realized pretty quickly that some things were missing. The investigators learned from Dustin's family that he would have had certain items with him. A Yeti cooler. Firearms, a .44 Magnum pistol in a holster and a shotgun. Cell phones. An axe. None of these items were at the campsite. The killer had taken them. That suggested a few things. First, the killer was thinking clearly enough after the murder to take items from the scene. This wasn't someone who killed in a blind rage and then ran away in panic. This was someone who stayed calm enough to look around, identify items they wanted or needed to take, and remove them from the scene. Second, some of these items were valuable. The firearms, the Yeti cooler, the phones, these had monetary value. Was robbery a motive? Or was the killer taking things they'd touched, trying to avoid leaving fingerprints and DNA evidence? The investigators collected what evidence they could from the scene. They found beer cans in the tent, Dustin's and at least one that appeared to be someone else's. They found shot glasses. They collected everything that might have fingerprints or DNA on it. They took samples that could be tested at the Montana State Crime Lab. This would become crucial to solving the case, but that would take time. DNA analysis isn't instant like it is on TV. It takes days or weeks to process samples, compare them to databases, get results. They also had to remove Dustin's body and transport it for autopsy. The medical examiner would need to document all the injuries, try to determine the sequence of events, estimate time of death, and gather any additional evidence from the body itself. The autopsy on Dustin Jersum's body confirmed what the investigators had suspected. He had died from the injuries inflicted during the attack. The medical examiner documented multiple chop wounds, including to his skull. Significant blunt force trauma. A stab wound to his neck. Other injuries consistent with a violent attack. The injuries showed this had been a sustained, brutal assault. The killer had used multiple weapons and had struck multiple times. This wasn't a single blow that accidentally went too far. This was someone who kept attacking until Dustin was dead. The autopsy also helped establish the timeline. Based on the condition of the body and other factors, the medical examiner could estimate that Dustin had died sometime on October 10th or early October 11th. That matched with what investigators knew about when Dustin had set up camp and when he'd failed to show up to pick up his girlfriend. So now investigators had a clearer picture. Dustin had been killed sometime Thursday evening or night, October 10th. Someone had attacked him in his tent, using weapons that were either brought to the scene or found at the campsite. The killer had then taken several items from the scene, including firearms, and left. Dustin's body had lain in the tent for approximately 2 days before being discovered. But who had killed him? And why? With a killer potentially still in the area, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office made a decision. They issued a public warning. They told people not to camp in the Moose Creek area until further notice. They let the community know that there had been a homicide at a campsite and that the killer was still at large. This created understandable fear in the Big Sky area. This was a place where people felt safe in the outdoors. Yes, there were natural dangers, wildlife, weather, the risks that come with any wilderness area, but murder at a campsite? That was different. That was someone deliberately hunting and killing another person in a place that was supposed to be peaceful and safe. Campground operators, resort employees, residents, tourists, everyone wanted to know, was the killer still out there? Would they strike again? Was it safe to go hiking? Was it safe to camp anywhere in the area? The investigators couldn't answer those questions yet. They didn't know who the killer was, which meant they didn't know if they'd killed before or might kill again. They didn't know if this was random or targeted. They didn't know if the killer was a local person or someone passing through. All they could do was tell people to be careful and hope they could solve the case quickly. And that meant processing all the evidence they'd collected and hoping something would lead them to the killer. The case got assigned to experienced homicide detectives with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. They partnered with investigators from the Montana Department of Justice. This was all hands on deck, everyone working to identify the killer before anyone else got hurt. They started with the basics. They interviewed Dustin's family and friends. Who was he? Who did he know? Did he have any enemies? Had anyone threatened him? Was there any reason to think someone might want to hurt him? The answers they got painted a picture of a good guy who didn't have enemies. He was a hard worker, a devoted father, someone who got along with people. There was no indication that anyone had a reason to target him specifically. They looked at his phone records, his social media, his financial records. Was there anything unusual in the days before his death? Any strange contacts, any concerning messages? Any sign that he was worried about something or someone? Nothing stood out. Everything pointed to this being exactly what it appeared to be, a guy going camping for the weekend, looking forward to time in the mountains with his girlfriend. So if this wasn't someone who knew Dustin and had a specific reason to want him dead, then what was it? A random encounter? Someone who came across the campsite and decided to attack? That was a terrifying possibility, because it meant the killer could strike again at any time, any place. The investigators sent the evidence they'd collected to the Montana State Crime Lab. The beer cans, the shot glasses, any other items that might have fingerprints or DNA. This became the highest priority for the lab. They needed results fast. And then they waited. Because sometimes in investigative work, that's all you can do. You collect the evidence, you send it to the experts, and you wait for science to give you answers. Meanwhile, the community remained on edge. News of the murder spread beyond Big Sky to Bozeman, Belgrade, and other communities in the area. People were talking about it, worrying about it, changing their plans because of it. Maybe they decided not to go camping that weekend. Maybe they decided to stay in more populated areas. And somewhere out there, the killer was going about their life, knowing what they'd done, knowing that Dustin's body had been found, knowing that investigators were looking for them. It was only a matter of time before the evidence caught up to them. The evidence processing at the Montana State Crime Lab took time, but the technicians were working as fast as they could. They knew there was a killer out there, and they knew the investigators needed answers. The beer can that had been found in Dustin's tent became the key piece of evidence. Remember, Abby had told investigators later that Dustin offered him a beer. Abby drank from that beer can, and then when he was taking items from the campsite to cover his tracks, he took the beer can too, probably because he knew it would have his DNA on it. But he missed something. Or maybe there was another beer can he didn't realize he'd touched. Or maybe he thought he'd gotten all the evidence but hadn't been thorough enough. Whatever the reason, investigators had a beer can that had DNA on it that wasn't Dustin's. The lab extracted the DNA and ran it through databases, looking for a match. And they got one. The DNA from the beer can match two people in the system, Darren Christopher Abbey and his twin brother, Dustin Abbey. Now, having a twin brother who shares your DNA complicates things, but it also narrows the field considerably. The investigators now knew they were looking for one of two people. And when they looked into both brothers, they found something important. Dustin Abbey, the twin brother, was currently incarcerated. He was in prison and had been there during the time of the murder. That meant the DNA had to belong to Darren Christopher Abbey. The investigators now had a name and a suspect. But they needed to find him and build a case against him. Having DNA evidence was great, but they needed more to ensure a conviction. They needed to understand what happened, why it happened, and they needed Abby's own words if possible. They started looking into Darren Abbey's background and whereabouts. Where was he living? Where had he been on October 10th? What could they learn about him that might help them understand this crime? What they found was concerning. Abbey had a criminal history. He'd been to prison before on DUI charges. He was currently on conditional release, which meant he was supposed to be following certain rules and checking in with his probation officer. And according to some records, he had connections to extremist groups. But none of that told them where he was right now or gave them enough to arrest him. They needed more. The investigators continued working the case from multiple angles. They looked at where Abbey had been employed. They talked to people who knew him. They tried to establish his movements on October 10th and the days following the murder. They also looked at whether Abbey had tried to sell or dispose of any of the items taken from Dustin's campsite. The firearms, especially, would be valuable and identifiable. If Abbey tried to sell them or was caught with them, that would be additional evidence. They checked pawn shops, gun stores, online marketplaces, anywhere Abbey might have tried to unload stolen property. They put out alerts to other law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for the missing items. And they prepared to interview Abbey if and when they could find him and bring him in. They needed to be ready with the right questions, the right approach, the right evidence to confront him with. In late October 2024, investigators located Abbey and brought him in for questioning. This was a critical moment in the case. They had DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene, but they needed more. They needed his confession. The interview with Darren Christopher Abbey took place at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. Experienced detectives sat down across from him in an interview room, the kind of room you've probably seen on TV, with a table, uncomfortable chairs, and a camera recording everything. They started by establishing rapport, getting Abbey talking, making him feel comfortable. They asked about his background, his life, where he'd been recently. Just general conversation to start. Then they began steering the conversation toward October 10th. Where had Abby been that day? Had he been camping? Had he been in the Big Sky area? And here's where Abby made a decision that would seal his fate. He could have refused to talk, asked for a lawyer, stayed silent. But he didn't. He started talking. And once he started, he kept going. Abby admitted that he'd been camping in the Moose Creek area on October 10th. He admitted that he'd come across Dustin's campsite. He admitted that Dustin had welcomed him and offered him a beer. The detectives let him talk, encouraging him to tell the whole story. And Abby did. He described the attack. He described using the wood, the screwdriver, the axe. He described taking items from the campsite. He described coming back the next day looking for his beanie. It was a full confession. Abby admitted to killing Dustin Gerson. But he offered no real explanation for why. When the detectives asked what had motivated the attack, Abby didn't have a clear answer. There was no big argument. Dustin hadn't threatened him or insulted him. There was no obvious trigger. The prosecutor would later tell the jury something chilling about this. During the interview, Abby had said he was aiming for his head. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was intentional, brutal violence with no apparent justification. Maybe Abby felt entitled to that campsite and was angry that Dustin had gotten there first. Maybe there was something about Dustin that set him off for reasons we'll never understand. Maybe the associations with extremist groups had warped his thinking in ways that made him capable of this kind of violence. Maybe he was under the influence of something. Maybe he just had violence in him that was looking for an outlet. We may never know the real answer. But what we do know is that Abby chose to attack and kill a man who had shown him hospitality. And then he chose to cover it up and try to get away with it. After the confession, Darren Christopher Abby was formally arrested and charged with deliberate homicide, which is Montana's term for murder, and tampering with evidence. The deliberate homicide charge was straightforward. Abby had admitted to intentionally killing Dustin Gerson. The evidence backed up his confession. This was murder, pure and simple. The tampering with evidence charge related to Abby taking items from the crime scene, washing the weapons, and generally trying to cover up what he'd done. In Montana, tampering with evidence is a serious felony on its own. Abby was held without bond, meaning he couldn't post bail and get out while waiting for trial. Given the severity of the charges and his criminal history, the judge determined he was too much of a flight risk and potentially a danger to the community. The news of the arrest brought some relief to the Big Sky area. The killer had been caught. He was in custody. People could go camping again without quite as much fear. The community could start to process what had happened without worrying that the killer was still out there. But for Dustin's family, the arrest was just the beginning of a long, painful process. Now they had to get through a trial, listen to the details of how Dustin died, and hope for justice. After being charged, Abby was arraigned in Gallatin County District Court. This is where he formally heard the charges against him and entered a plea. Based on the confession and the evidence, you might think Abby would plead guilty. Why go through a trial when you've already admitted to the crime on camera? But Abby's defense attorneys advised him to enter a plea of not guilty. This is actually common in serious criminal cases, even when the evidence seems overwhelming. It preserves the defendant's rights, forces the prosecution to prove their case, and leaves room for plea negotiations. The case moved through the legal system through late 2024 and into early 2025. Pre-trial motions were filed. The defense challenged certain pieces of evidence. They argued about what could be shown to the jury and what couldn't. The defense was in a difficult position. They had their client's confession on video. They had DNA evidence. They had the circumstantial evidence of the missing items. They had the timeline. Everything pointed to Abby being guilty. But the defense had to mount some kind of defense. That's their job, even in cases that seem hopeless. So they looked for any angle they could find. They questioned the DNA evidence procedures. Had the samples been properly collected and stored? Could there have been contamination? They questioned whether the confession was truly voluntary. Had Abby been coerced? Had his rights been properly explained to him? They looked at Abby's mental health history and his associations with extremist groups. Could they argue diminished capacity? That he wasn't fully responsible for his actions due to mental illness or ideology? None of these arguments were particularly strong, but the defense had to try something. Meanwhile, the prosecution was building an ironclad case. They had the confession. They had the DNA. They had witnesses who could place Abby in the area. They had experts who could testify about the injuries and what weapons caused them. They had a clear timeline of events. This was a case they were confident they could win. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared their presentations. The prosecution prepared to call witnesses, the medical examiner who did the autopsy, the crime lab technicians who processed the DNA, the detectives who interviewed Abby, possibly Dustin's girlfriend and family members to establish who he was and why he was at that campsite. They prepared to show the jury the video of Abby's confession. They prepared exhibits, photos of the crime scene, maps of the area, the beer can with the DNA evidence. They prepared their opening and closing arguments. They would tell the jury the story of what happened. A kind man went camping. A stranger showed up. The man welcomed him. And the stranger killed him for no good reason. Then the stranger tried to cover it up and would have gotten away with it if not for DNA evidence and good detective work. The defense prepared their counter-narrative. They would try to humanize Abby, explain his difficult background, suggest there might be more to the story than anyone knew. They would challenge the evidence where they could and hope that even one juror might have reasonable doubt. But as the trial date got closer, something changed. The defense and prosecution entered into negotiations. This is common in criminal cases, even serious ones. Both sides discuss the possibility of a plea deal, where the defendant pleads guilty in exchange for some concession from the prosecution. In a case like this, what would a plea deal look like? The prosecution would want Abby to plead guilty to the murder charge. They'd want to ensure he went to prison for a very long time. But they might be willing to make some concessions to avoid a trial. Why would the prosecution want to avoid a trial if their case was so strong? A few reasons. First, trials are expensive and time-consuming. Second, there's always some risk that something could go wrong, a witness could say the wrong thing, a juror could be sympathetic to the defendant, an appeals court could find some error. Third, a trial would require Dustin's family to sit through days of testimony about how he died, which is traumatic. If the family wanted to avoid that trauma and was willing to accept a plea deal, the prosecution would consider it. For Abby, a plea deal meant certainty. He'd know exactly what his sentence was going to be. If he went to trial and lost, he might face an even harsher sentence. But if he accepted a deal, he could avoid the risk of a worse outcome. After negotiations, they reached an agreement. In early 2025, Darren Christopher Abbey agreed to plead guilty to deliberate homicide and tampering with evidence. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to recommend a specific sentence to the judge. This meant there would be no trial. No jury would hear the evidence. Abbey would simply admit in court that he'd killed Dustin Kjersom and tried to cover it up. On the day of the plea hearing, Abbey appeared in court with his attorneys. The judge asked him a series of questions to make sure he understood what he was doing. Did he understand the charges against him? Did he understand his rights? Was anyone forcing him to plead guilty? Did he understand the consequences of pleading guilty? Abbey answered appropriately to each question. And then he formally entered his plea, guilty to deliberate homicide, guilty to tampering with evidence. The judge accepted the plea, which meant Abbey was now a convicted murderer. The only thing left was sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place on May 1, 2025 at the Gallatin County District Court in Bozeman, Montana. This was the opportunity for Dustin's family to make victim impact statements, to tell the court how Dustin's murder had affected their lives. And it was the opportunity for the judge to hear from both sides before imposing sentence. Dustin's family members stood before the court and spoke about the man they'd lost. His sister talked about how he was always working, always trying to improve himself and provide for his children. She talked about how those children would now grow up without their father. How they'd miss his guidance, his love, his presence at all the important moments in their lives. His girlfriend, who had found his body, spoke about the trauma of that discovery. About the nightmares and the therapy and the way that October Day in 2024 had changed her life forever. About how she'd never feel completely safe camping again, never be able to look at the mountains in quite the same way. His parents spoke about the unbearable pain of losing a child. About how it doesn't matter that he was 35 years old and a father himself, he was still their son, and they'd had to bury him. About how they'd never get to see what else he would have accomplished, never get to see their grandchildren grow up with their father. The family asked the judge to impose the harshest sentence allowed by law. They wanted Abby to spend the rest of his life in prison for what he'd done. Then Abby's defense attorneys spoke. They talked about his difficult childhood, his time in foster care, his struggles with mental health. They argued that while what he did was terrible, he deserved some consideration for his background and circumstances. They asked the judge to show mercy in sentencing. Abby himself was given the opportunity to speak. In Montana, defendants have the right to make a statement before sentencing. Abby could have apologized, could have expressed remorse, could have tried to explain himself. But according to reports from the hearing, Abby showed no remorse. He didn't apologize to Dustin's family. He didn't express regret for what he'd done. He remained largely silent, offering no explanation or justification for the murder. The prosecutor spoke, laying out the aggravating factors in the case. The extreme violence of the murder. The vulnerable position Dustin was in when attacked. The fact that Dustin had shown Abby hospitality. The premeditation shown by Abby bringing weapons and wearing gloves. The cover-up attempts. The lack of any justification or provocation. Abby's criminal history. His lack of remorse. Under Montana law, deliberate homicide carries a possible sentence of 10 to 100 years in prison, or life imprisonment with or without the possibility of parole. The judge considered all the factors. The brutal nature of the crime. The impact on Dustin's family and children. Abby's background and history. The complete lack of justification for the murder. Abby's attempts to cover it up. His lack of remorse even after being caught and convicted. And then Judge Holly Brown imposed sentence. Darren Christopher Abby was sentenced to life in prison plus 80 years. That's not a typo. Life plus 80 years. Let me break down how that works. In Montana, a life sentence means the person will spend the rest of their natural life in prison. They will never be released. They will die in custody. The additional 80 years was added for the tampering with evidence charge and potentially as a way to ensure that even if the life sentence was somehow overturned on appeal, Abby would still face an extremely long prison term. But the key phrase in the sentence was this: no possibility of parole. Ever. This is what's called a life without parole sentence, or LWOP. It means exactly what it says. Abby will never be eligible for parole. He will never get a hearing to determine if he's been rehabilitated. He will never have a chance to convince anyone to let him out. He will be in prison until he dies. He's 41 years old as of the sentencing. Assuming he lives an average lifespan, he'll spend the next 30, 40, maybe 50 years behind bars. He'll grow old in prison. He'll likely die in prison. And that's exactly what the judge intended. Judge Brown made it clear in her sentencing remarks that the brutal nature of the crime and the complete lack of justification warranted the harshest possible punishment. Dustin Chersom had done nothing wrong. He'd welcomed a stranger to his campsite. He'd offered hospitality. And that stranger had murdered him in the most vicious way imaginable. There was no mercy in this crime, the judge said, so there would be little mercy in the sentence. For Dustin's family, the sentence brought some measure of closure. Abby would never hurt anyone else. He'd never walk free. He'd never have the opportunity to go camping in the mountains or enjoy any of the freedoms that Dustin had been denied. But no sentence could bring Dustin back. No amount of prison time could undo what happened on October 10, 2024. The family would still have to live with the loss, the grief, the hole in their lives where Dustin used to be. After the sentencing, Darren Christopher Abbey was transported to the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, Montana. This is a maximum security facility where Montana's most dangerous criminals are housed. It's where Abbey will spend the rest of his life. Life in prison without parole is not easy. Abbey will be in a cell, probably about 6 feet by 8 feet, for most of every day. He'll eat prison food. He'll have limited contact with the outside world. He'll follow the prison schedule and rules. Any privileges he might have, recreation time, phone calls, visits, can be taken away if he misbehaves. He'll likely be in protective custody or isolated housing, because murders of strangers in the wilderness don't make you popular even among other prisoners. Other inmates might see him as dangerous or unstable. Prison staff will see him as someone who needs to be watched carefully. And every day for the rest of his life, he'll wake up in that cell knowing he'll never leave. Never see the mountains again. Never feel completely free again. That's his punishment. The murder of Dustin Gersom had a profound impact on the Big Sky area and the broader Montana outdoor community. For weeks after the murder, campgrounds were quieter than usual. People were nervous about camping alone or in remote areas. Some people canceled trips or changed their plans to stay closer to populated areas. The Moose Creek area where Dustin was killed developed a sad kind of notoriety. People knew it as the place where that camper was murdered. Some people avoided it entirely. Others would drive by and think about what happened there. But gradually, as Abbey was caught, convicted, and sentenced, people started to feel safer again. The knowledge that the killer was in prison for life helped. The understanding that this was a random encounter, not a serial killer stalking campers, helped too. Campgrounds and outdoor recreation areas in Montana put up more safety notices. Advice about camping in groups when possible. Reminders to tell someone where you're going and when you'll be back. Suggestions to carry communication devices that work even without cell service, like satellite messengers. The local outdoor community also started talking more openly about the risks that exist beyond wildlife. We talk a lot about bear safety, about what to do if you encounter a moose or a mountain lion. But human danger? That's harder to prepare for, harder to predict. Some people in the camping and hiking community started carrying personal protection devices more consistently: pepper spray, firearms, personal alarms. Not out of paranoia, but out of a realistic acknowledgement that even in the wilderness, the most dangerous animal is sometimes another human being. In the months following Dustin's death and Abbey's conviction, Dustin's family and friends worked to make sure he was remembered for who he was, not just how he died. They shared photos and stories of Dustin, working on construction projects, spending time with his kids, enjoying the outdoors he loved so much. They wanted people to remember him as a skilled craftsman, a devoted father, a kind person who would help anyone who needed it. They talked about his generosity, which was ultimately what led to his death. Dustin was the kind of person who would welcome a stranger and offer them a beer. In a better world, that kindness would have led to a pleasant conversation and a new acquaintance. But Dustin encountered someone who repaid that kindness with violence. Some of Dustin's friends and family have become advocates for outdoor safety. They speak at community events about the importance of being aware of your surroundings, of trusting your instincts, of taking precautions even when you think you're safe. But they also emphasize that what happened to Dustin was exceptionally rare. Millions of people camp in Montana and across the country every year without incident. The wilderness is generally safe. Most people you encounter on trails and at campgrounds are good people who just want to enjoy nature. Dustin's death was a tragedy, but it shouldn't make people afraid to go outside and experience the beauty of places like Big Sky. That would be the opposite of what Dustin would have wanted. He loved the mountains. He loved camping. He'd want people to continue enjoying those experiences. Even with Abby convicted and sentenced, some questions about this case remain unanswered. The biggest question is, why? What actually motivated Abby to attack Dustin? Abby never gave a clear explanation. He confessed to the murder and described what he did, but he didn't explain why he did it. Was it anger that Dustin had the campsite Abby wanted? Was it some perceived slight or insult that no one else would understand? Was it the influence of extremist ideology? Was it intoxication or mental illness affecting his judgment? Was it just random violence from someone who had violence in them waiting to come out? We don't know. Maybe Abby himself doesn't fully know. Maybe there is no rational explanation because the act itself was irrational. Another question, could this have been prevented? Abby had a criminal history. He'd been to prison before. He was on conditional release when he killed Dustin. Should he have been supervised more closely? Were there warning signs that were missed? These are difficult questions without easy answers. We can't lock up everyone who might potentially commit a crime. We have to balance public safety with individual rights. The parole and probation system does its best to supervise people who are transitioning out of prison, but resources are limited and predicting who will reoffend is not an exact science. Was there a moment when someone could have intervened in Abby's life and changed the trajectory that led to Dustin's death? Maybe. But we'll never know for sure. Dustin Jersum's murder is part of a broader reality about violence in America. Every year, thousands of people are murdered in circumstances that range from domestic violence to gang conflicts to random encounters like this one. Each of those victims was a real person with a life, with people who loved them, with plans and dreams that were cut short. Each of those cases leaves families devastated and communities shaken. Dustin's case got significant media attention because of the unusual circumstances, the initial belief it might be a bear attack, the remote wilderness location, the fact that the victim had shown his killer hospitality. These elements made it newsworthy in a way that, sadly, many murders are not. But every murder victim deserves to be remembered and mourned. Every family left behind deserves justice. And every community affected by violence deserves to feel safe again. Dustin's case also highlights the importance of forensic science in solving crimes. Without DNA analysis, Abby might never have been caught. He'd taken precautions to cover his tracks, removing items from the crime scene, washing weapons, coming back to look for evidence he might have left. If not for that beer can with his DNA on it, and the excellent work of the Montana State Crime Lab and the investigators who built the case, Abby might have gotten away with murder. That's both reassuring and sobering. Reassuring because it shows that even careful criminals can be caught through good police work and science. Sobering because it makes you wonder how many crimes go unsolved because the evidence isn't there or isn't properly collected and analyzed. As we come to the end of this story, I want to circle back to where we started, with Dustin Jersum the person, not Dustin Jersum the victim. He was 35 years old. He was a father of 2. He was a skilled craftsman who could build homes and fix anything. He was someone who loved the outdoors and found peace in the mountains. He was the kind of person who would welcome a stranger and offer them a beer. He was planning a weekend camping trip with his girlfriend. He'd spent hours setting up a comfortable campsite so they could enjoy their time together. He was looking forward to picking her up Friday evening and bringing her back to the mountains he loved. He never got to do that. He never got to see his children grow up. He never got to build another home or take another camping trip or have another beer by a campfire. All of that was taken from him by someone who decided, for reasons we may never fully understand, that Dustin's life didn't matter. But Dustin's life did matter. It mattered to his children, who lost their father. It mattered to his girlfriend, who has to live with the trauma of finding his body. It mattered to his sister and parents and the rest of his family. It mattered to his friends and colleagues. It mattered to his community. And the fact that his life was taken so senselessly, so brutally, by someone he tried to help, that makes his death even more tragic. So that's the story of what happened to Dustin Gerson. A story that started with a man going camping in the mountains he loved and ended with a murder, an investigation, a confession, and a life sentence. It's a story that raises questions about human nature, about violence, about the risks we take just by being kind to strangers. It's a story about the worst thing that can happen when you extend hospitality to someone and they repay it with violence. But I don't want to end this on a note of cynicism or fear. Yes, bad things can happen. Yes, there are dangerous people in the world. Yes, kindness can sometimes be exploited or punished. But for every Darren Christopher Abbey, there are thousands of people who would accept a beer at a campsite and respond with conversation, with friendship, with gratitude. For every act of senseless violence, there are countless acts of kindness and generosity that make the world better. Dustin's instinct to welcome a stranger wasn't wrong. His generosity wasn't a mistake. He was being who he was, a good person trying to share a bit of warmth and hospitality with someone else who was out in the cold mountains. The fact that he encountered someone who responded to that kindness with violence is a tragedy. But it doesn't mean we should all become suspicious and closed off and unwilling to help each other. What it means is that we should be aware. We should trust our instincts. If something feels wrong, it's okay to listen to that feeling. It's okay to keep your distance. It's okay to be careful. But we shouldn't let fear keep us from experiencing the world, from enjoying nature, from being kind to the people we encounter along the way. Dustin loved the mountains. He died in the mountains, but his death shouldn't make the mountains a scary place. They're still beautiful. They're still worth visiting. They're still places where people can find peace and freedom and connection with nature. And most importantly, Dustin's death shouldn't make us forget how to be kind to each other. Yes, be careful. Yes, be aware. But don't lose that human instinct to help someone who might need it, to welcome someone who seems lost or cold or in need of connection. Because for every story like Dustin's, and thankfully, they're rare, there are millions of stories of people meeting in unexpected places and having positive interactions. Stories of strangers helping strangers. Stories of kindness being repaid with kindness. That's the world most of us live in most of the time. And while we need to acknowledge the dangers that exist, we shouldn't let those dangers define how we see the world and each other. So remember Dustin Gerson. Remember his kindness, his skills, his love for his children, his enjoyment of the simple pleasure of camping in the mountains. Remember that he was a good person who deserved better than what happened to him. And remember that Darren Christopher Abbey will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did. He won't hurt anyone else. He won't take any more lives. Justice, in this case at least, was served. As you drift off to sleep listening to this story and the rain sounds, I hope you can find some peace. I hope you can appreciate the safety and comfort you're in right now. I hope you can be grateful for the people in your life who care about you. And maybe, if you're so inclined, take a moment to think about Dustin and his family. Think about all the victims of violence who didn't get to live out their lives. Think about the families left behind, still grieving, still trying to make sense of senseless acts. Life is precious. Life is fragile. Every day we have is a gift. Dustin's story reminds us of that in the hardest way possible. Be kind to each other. Be careful when you need to be. Trust your instincts. Look out for the people you love. And try to live your life in a way that would make you proud if it were suddenly cut short. Dustin was doing that. He was being a good dad. He was working hard. He was enjoying the outdoors. He was being kind to a stranger. It cost him everything. But that doesn't mean he was wrong to live that way. Rest in peace, Dustin Jerson. You deserve so much better. And to everyone listening, take care of yourselves. Appreciate the moments you have. Hug the people you love. Get outside and enjoy nature when you can. But always, always trust your instincts. Stay safe out there. Good night.